Well, as I'm standing in line, the line goes out of the Apple store and down like 3 or 4 stores. So every 15 minutes, we're moving a few feet. As I'm standing there, these 3 high school students walk up to the guy right next to me. They said word for word, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" The guy turns around, leans on the railing, doesn't say a single word. So they're a little bit embarrassed. They start to walk away. I stopped them. I said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" They said, "Well, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" I said, "You know, I'm not even sure Jesus existed. Do you really believe that Christian stuff?" This guy looks at me, goes, "Well, yes, I do. It's in the Bible, the Word of God." And he starts to preach the gospel to me. I said, "Why should I believe that story?" He holds up his Bible. He goes, "Because it's right here in the Bible, the Word of God." I said, "Why should I believe that book?" He said, "Well, if you turn to this passage in 2 Timothy, it tells us that all Scripture is inspired." I said, "Wait a minute. If we want to know if that book is true, you can't turn to a passage within that book, assuming it's true, to prove itself, right?" He goes, "Good point." I said, "Do you have any evidence outside of this book that tells us what's contained within it is actually true?" And the guy goes, "Well, yes, actually, there's these ancient manuscripts, tens of thousands of them, that perfectly match up and tell us we have the Bible exactly as it was written down." I said, "Really, do you know how many words are in the original Greek New Testament?" And at this point, I know exactly what he was thinking. Why did I have to talk to this guy? He said, "No," I said, "there's about 135,000 words. Now, if you take the different manuscripts you're talking about, do you realize there's between 300,000 and 400,000 differences? That means for every word in the Bible, there could be 2 or 3 other words. Can you explain that to me?" He goes, "What do you think about evolution?" I said, "I'm glad you asked. The evidence is overwhelming. Don't you know humans and chimps share 99.732% DNA similarity? Have you seen homologous structures across organisms in nature? Have you seen the patterns in biogeography and homology?" I'm going on and on. And this guy is backing up and his eyes are getting as big as silver dollars. Until finally I stopped. I said, "You know, I got a confession to make. I'm a Christian." I wish you could see his response. He goes, "Oh." But the girl next to him looked really bothered by this. She goes, "Was all that true?" I said, "Most of it, no." I said, "In fact, some of it I just made up." I said, "Look, good for you guys. On a Saturday in Southern California, 10 minutes from the beach, being at the mall, sharing your faith, way to go. But don't you think if you're going to go tell people they should bank their lives on this ancient book, you have some good reason to believe this book is true?" They agreed, left on their way. 10 minutes later, I'm facing this direction. I feel a tap on the shoulder. I turn around. It's 3 new students who say, "Hey, we're talking about Jesus. What do you think?" Well, I'm tired of sitting in line, so I launch into my charade again until I stop, and I look about as far back as the back of this room. I see the original students who set up their friends to convert the atheist. Now, I do love sharing that story, and typically when I ask students, I'll say, "Do you admire them?" They'll be like, "Sure." They're using their time. They're talking about Jesus. I said, "Do they love God with their hearts?" "Yes." "Do they love God with their strength?" "Yes." "Do you think those students love God with their mind?" And there's a pause. See, we're told in Scripture to be ready with an answer. That's our theme this week, isn't it? Have a reason, be ready with an answer. Now, this morning we saw that truth exists. Truth is important. All religions can't be true. Then we began to ask the question, how do we know Christianity is true? One way we can begin to ask this question and answer it is to look at the historical evidence that the Bible is true. And we're going to uniquely look, not the Bible as a whole, but the New Testament, and in particular, the Gospels. And what we're going to do is just look at what I call 3 tests that historians use when they judge any ancient book. So the competition test, the companion test, and the corroboration test. Now, we'll come back and we'll break these down, but we're simply saying, if we apply the standard means of historicity or historiography to the Bible, how does the Bible fare? Do we have good reason to believe it's actually true? Now, much of the evidence for this comes from a book my father wrote beginning in the 1970s. You see, my father grew up in a small town in Michigan. and he had a pretty difficult, painful childhood. And he met some Christians who had a joy about life that he wanted. It was attractive to him. And they asked him, they told him Jesus Christ changed their lives. My dad thought it was a joke. He had a full scholarship to law school. So he had enough money saved. He left to go around the world in the 50s to find the evidence to prove that the Bible is false. And he ended up becoming a Christian, partly because the evidence was so compelling. And he wrote this book you can see on the left in 1972 called Evidence That Demands Verdict. Now, just 2 falls ago, about a year and a half ago, my father and I updated it together in that book, Evidence Demands Verdict, with all the new evidence. Now, why am I telling you this? Because my father's been studying this about a half a century plus. And I asked my dad, he said, in the 50s, when you set out to disprove Christianity, how does the evidence for Christianity compare now to when it did a half century ago? And he looked at me and goes, son, there's a tsunami of evidence. Did you hear that? Someone who's been doing this for decade after decade. He looked at me, he goes, son, there's a ton of evidence if Christians would just look for it and find it. So I wrote an article for him, and he approved it, and he edited it, that was about his story, submitted it to Fox News, called The Evidence for Christianity is Like a Tsunami. It went viral, and that book, Evidence Demands Verdict, was launched into number 16 on all the books on Amazon. That's pretty cool for an apologetics book. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because we live in an age where people say, oh, feelings trump truth. But when it gets down to it, I think people are hungry for evidence. They want to know what's true. And it's your job and my job to be ready with an answer when people ask us. So let's look at our first test, what we call the composition test. And we're asking, were these documents composed or put together with honesty? Do we have reason to believe that the writer of this document is reliable and true and cares about truth? Now, the place to start with this question is simply to ask, does the writer of an ancient document claim to care about truth? That's where you start. Well, if you just read the New Testament and the Gospels, I think you'd be amazed at how many times the writers go out of their way to tell us that they care about truth. So what was Luke's profession, by the way? He was a doctor. He was a physician. Luke was educated. Do you know how he begins his gospel? Luke says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. He said, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me also to write an orderly account so you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Do you know what this is? This is an ancient way of saying, I'm not writing fiction, I'm not being careless. I have done my due diligence to report to you accurately as best I can. Well, I have a friend of mine who doubts that Jesus even existed. He thinks it's all a myth. I said to him, the Bible anticipated that you would come along. Notice what Peter writes. In 2 Peter 1:16, Peter, who was an eyewitness, said, we did not follow cleverly invented stories or myths when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So Luke wasn't an eyewitness, but he interviewed eyewitnesses. Peter says, we saw ourselves were eyewitnesses. Now, John, the beloved disciple, also claimed to be an eyewitness. I'm going to put a verse up here, and I want you to notice how many different senses does John appeal to. So he says, what was from the beginning, what we've heard, what we've looked at, what we have touched with our hands, he says, we've proclaimed to you. How many senses does John appeal to? 3, that's right. I did hear a 4 up there. But that's the junior high section, so they're okay. They'll learn. That's good, you'll learn. My daughter's going to 7th grade, so I have the right to pick on junior hires. Maybe. How many senses? 3. John says what we heard, what we looked at, what we touched, we proclaimed to you. So John's saying this wasn't passed down from someone to someone to someone. He says we saw it, we heard it, we touched it, and this is the story that we proclaim to you. Now, when a story is made up, how does it often begin? once upon a time, right? Or a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Right, when I was a kid and that came up, I got like goosebumps. I loved it. Now notice this story was placed in a distant galaxy. It's not named, there's no details, it's fictional. When people are inventing stories, they often place it in a distant land that nobody can check out. It's an interesting question. Do the biblical writers tell this story about this Jesus figure in some distant land that's unnamed? The answer is no. Look at this passage I'm going to put up and notice how many particular details Luke gives us. He says, now in the 15th year, not the 10th year, not the 14th year, gives us the exact year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, not Julius Caesar, not Augustus Caesar, not Nero, when Pontius Pilate was governor. Of all the different regions, gives us Pontius Pilate and his position. Of Judea, the region, Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea. Then he tells the story of Jesus. You see what Luke is doing? He's saying this isn't once upon a time. This isn't in a galaxy far, far away. Here's the people, places, times, and the year. Go check it out yourself if you don't believe me. And history confirms what Luke records. So right away, when we just look in the New Testament, you realize they say we were eyewitnesses. We investigated this, we touched, we saw, we heard, and they give us very particular details tied to the story. So it seems to have the ring of authenticity, but there's something else that convinced me this book was composed or put together with care for truth. So historians have something they call the criterion of embarrassment. So what does this mean? As historians look at ancient books, if they find material embarrassing to the person who wrote it, they assume the author didn't make it up, but cares enough about truth to cast his or her himself in an embarrassing light. You see, when we make up truth, when we make up lies, it's either to get out of trouble or to make ourselves look good. I doubt any of you woke up this morning and said, you know what? I wonder what I can post on Instagram so everybody just thinks I'm an idiot. Like that probably hasn't gone through your mind. In fact, my sister a few years ago, she's 10 years younger than I am, she left her computer open at her house. And I walked by and I noticed her Facebook page. And I just felt compelled as her older brother to let the world know on her behalf how incredible and impactful and wonderful her older brother is. So I wrote this whole thing like, I just want to give a shout out to my brother. He's changed my life. I went on. I just poured it on. So she gets on there later, and it didn't take her very long to figure out, oh, my other two sisters wouldn't have made this up. She knew exactly it was me. Because human nature is when we make stuff up, we make ourselves to look good. So when historians look at an ancient book and they notice that a writer includes embarrassing material or disparaging, the critical historian goes, wow, this is a writer that has composed this book with care about truth. So have you ever read the New Testament and the Gospels and noticed how much embarrassing material the writers include? So for example, Peter denies Jesus. Why would they make that up? That doesn't cast Peter in a very positive light. Or how about Jesus calls Peter Satan? Look, this wasn't a joke. Okay, about a year ago, my son was into these your mama jokes. He goes, hey, Dad, your mama is so poor, ducks throw bread at her. I was like, Scotty, my mom is your grandma. He goes, I know, I don't mean it personally, but that's funny, isn't it? I'm like, okay, that's funny. Now, it's not like Jesus and Peter are sitting around having this exchange of your mama jokes. It's like, oh, you got me, it's Satan. This is not what happened. This was the insult of insults. Why would the apostles make up a story that Jesus called Peter, the lead of the apostles, Satan? It makes no sense. How about the disciples fall asleep in Gethsemane? 3 times Jesus says, stay awake, the time is near, be alert, and they fall asleep. Why would they make up a story and say that they fell asleep. Do you notice in Mark chapter 4, the disciples don't even understand the parable of the sower? If they're making up this story, they're like, yeah, let's pretend that we didn't understand and Jesus had to correct us. Of course they don't make that up. In fact, you've probably read this story 100 times about the women discovering the empty tomb. You know, in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's. It was a patriarchal culture. She wasn't educated like a man. So if the apostles are inventing a story that relies upon a death, burial, empty tomb, why would they make the first witnesses women unless it was true? Do you see the point? The Gospels are filled with embarrassing material that casts the writers in a negative light. You know what this tells me? That the writers care more about truth than the impression the world has about their character. That's because they had character and they cared about truth. But ultimately convinced me I could trust the apostles. It is what it cost them to believe in the risen Jesus. You see, if you look at the apostles according to church history, Peter was crucified, Andrew was crucified, Philip crucified, Bartholomew flayed to death, James the Greater beheaded, Matthew killed with a sword, Matthias stoned to death, and this has nothing to do with smoking pot. I have to clarify in my great state of California now that it's legal. Thomas stabbed with spears, John died after exile, Luke hanged, James just thrown and beheaded, Mark dragged to death by horse, and Paul beheaded. Now, I actually did a 300-page academic dissertation on this topic, and for some of these, it's hard to know when history ends and when legend begins. But I think we know for sure that Peter, James, and Paul were willing to put themselves in harm's way because they refused to recant their belief in Jesus. I think we can show that all four of those died as martyrs. But all the apostles, you read the beginning of Acts, it says they went out preaching Jesus. They were threatened, they were beaten, they were thrown in prison. All they had to do was stop preaching that Jesus had risen from the grave and was the Messiah, and they'd survive. But they refused. Why? Because they had the character to put their lives on the line because they believed in the depths of their heart that Jesus had risen from the grave. Friends, some of you might remember 2 years ago, a friend of mine, J. Warner Wallace, was here, former atheist, cold case detective, who talked about why he believed in the resurrection and told his story. Well, J. Warner Wallace, in case, probably some of you remember this, he has never lost a case. He's a cold case detective in over 30 years. He's appeared on Dateline and Nightline and these TV shows, as far as I'm aware of, more than any other cold case detective. He's brilliant. Well, he told me in every case he's ever had that every single person who commits a crime does it for one of three reasons: sex or lust, power, or money. Power, sex, and money. That's the motivation. Well, let's talk about the apostles for a second. Was it about power? No, Jesus said, if you want to follow me, pick up your own cross and lay down your life. You've got to be a servant. It wasn't about power. Was it about sex? Jesus wasn't even married. And in fact, what's amazing is even today you look back at Jesus and see the dignity and care and respect he had for women. Friends, it wasn't about power, it wasn't about sex, and it wasn't about money. Jesus died, as far as we know, with basically the clothes on his back. He said, give your money away to the poor. You know what this tells me? When we look at the writings of the Gospels, they had the character to write down and go to the grave that they believed this was true. What else could the apostles have done to convince us that they composed this book with character? I conclude as a historian, I can trust Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the writers of the New Testament. Now, the second test we ask is what's called the companion test. Now we want to know, have these documents reached us accurately? So a number of years ago, I landed in a plane. I live in Orange County in a town called San Juan Capistrano. And I landed on a plane, and I'm pulling in, and as we pull our bags down, I looked ahead about 10 rows, and I saw one of my best friends pulling his bag down. I was like, what? We're on the same flight. I didn't even see him. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to text him so he stays afterwards. I'm not going to yell his name because it's never really good to yell anything on a plane. I'm just going to text him so he hangs afterwards. So I pulled out my phone. I texted him. I said, hey, punk, turn around. I'm right behind you. And I sent it to my mom, who was home alone at night reading. Fortunately, my mom has a good sense of humor. She texted me back word for word and said, hey, son, I think you got the wrong punk. I was like, man, I broke rule number 1. Don't punk your mom. Isn't it amazing, though, today, with all our means of technology, social media, email, text, calls, still sometimes information doesn't arrive at the source and it's not understood the way we want it to be understood. If sometimes we have fake news today, how can we trust a book from 2,000 years ago? How do we know, like the telephone? How many of you played the telephone game? Let me see your hands. Okay, good. Everybody knows the telephone game, where a message is passed down, and either intentionally or unintentionally, the message is changed. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, I can trust the apostles. They care about truth, but how do I know this message wasn't corrupted or changed as it was passed down 2,000 years? Well, this is a question that historians called textual critics ask, not just about the Bible. They ask it about any book. And they have ways of trying to ascertain if we can trust that a book's been passed on accurately. And they do this by asking 2 questions. 1, what's the time gap between the original copy and the copies we have today? So just think about it. It's kind of obvious. When a book was first written down, how close is the copy we have to when it was first written? So you tell me, do we want a smaller time gap or a bigger one? A smaller one. There's less room for intentional or unintentional error. So they'd write an original down on a scroll or what's called a codice, an ancient book, but then it would disintegrate. So what they had to do is they had to copy it. So the question is, generation 1, generation 2, generation 3, generation 30, which generation do we have? How close are we back to the original? So generation 3 is likely more trustworthy than 23 versus 63 versus 103. So how close can we get? Because each time it's copied, a little bit of information can get lost. So I don't know if you've seen this movie or not, but the character named Michael Keaton, who's the Vulture in the first Spider-Man Homecoming, in the good movie, right? Okay, honestly, how many of you straight up wept in Infinity War when Spider-Man, oh my goodness. I was in the theater and this lady was flat out weeping. I was like, you know he's coming back. She was really invested in the character. Well, Michael Keaton, who played the Vulture, he was in a movie probably in the early or sometime in the 90s called Multiplicity. 2 of you have seen it, great. Now in this movie, they cloned Michael Keaton, but instead of cloning the original, they cloned the 2nd generation. Then they clone the 3rd generation. Then they clone the 4th generation. So each time it's removed and they clone it, he gets a little bit more messed up because information is lost. Well, in a sense, that's what can happen with writing of a book. The further removed it is, arguably, there's a greater chance we've lost some of the accuracy. So if you look at some ancient writings that would be considered contemporaries of the New Testament, people like Pliny the Elder, who's a Roman writer, from the time he wrote it to the copy we have is 700 years. We have no record of the transmission. Josephus, one of the most important Jewish writers, the end of the 1st century, 800 years to the copy we have. Herodotus, who is a Greek writer, one of the most important historians of ancient Greece, 1,500 years. So if you look at a chart here, 0 would be when it was written. A number of ancient books that historians basically trust are 700, 1,000, 1,400, 1,500 years removed from the source itself. The question you're probably thinking is, okay, wait a minute. How close do we have a copy or a part of a copy for the New Testament? Well, for the New Testament we have within 40 years. Within 40 years. This is unprecedented, historically speaking. See, there's a portion of the Gospel of John, it's called P52, it's chapter 18, about the size of a credit card. And we have the front and we have the back, roughly 120 to 130 AD. Now, if this dating is right, John died in the 90s. This could have been written by somebody the generation after John the Apostle. That person possibly could have been alive when John was alive. Friends, historically speaking, this is amazing. This is why Daniel B. Wallace, arguably the leading textual critic in the world, he teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. He said, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone else in the ancient world, including Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know any Julius Caesar skeptics. I don't know any Alexander the Great doubters. Why? Because here's the deal. When it's all said and done, it doesn't matter for the state of your soul who you believe Alexander the Great was. But Jesus said the most important question we need to ask is, who do you say that I am? Because it matters so much who Jesus is. You'll often see people apply a double standard to Jesus and the New Testament that they wouldn't to other ancient writings. Do you know the earliest biography we have for Alexander the Great is about 3 to 4 centuries removed? We have 4 biographies of Jesus within the century in which he lived. You're comparing apples and oranges. So the first one is how close are the manuscripts. The second one is how many manuscripts do we have? Now you tell me, do we want more manuscripts or less? We want more, that's right. Now the more we have, the more differences you might find, but ironically, the better chance we can reconstruct the original. That's right, we want more manuscripts. Now a manuscript is a handwritten copy before the printing press. So think about the time and the effort and the money to handwrite a copy of a book of the New Testament or the entire New Testament. That's what a manuscript is. Well, with Caesar, the Caesar contemporary of Jesus, we have 10 manuscripts. You can count that on 2 hands. Unless you're Bruce Almighty, you can do it on 1. Plato's tetralogies, there's 7 manuscripts in existence. We have 7 physical copies or portions of copies. For Plato's tetralogies, that's it. Do you know how many manuscripts we have for the New Testament? In the updated New Evidence, my father and I, a research assistant, did our best to absolutely track down the most accurate count of New Testament manuscripts that's out there. You know what it is for the New Testament? Over 24,000 manuscripts. You know one reason why there's so many? Because the Christians with their Jewish roots learned to reverence, to revere the scriptures that God had spoken through them. They revered the scriptures. They revered them. So if a visual chart that might be helpful is if you look at the New Testament, you got 24,000. The number 2 book in history, of ancient history, is the Iliad with about 1,900. Probably 15 times as many for the New Testament than there is for the number 2 book. And the Iliad was kind of like the Bible in ancient Greek culture. So here's a visual way that might help. The average classical writer, this means Greeks, Jews, Romans, who wrote around the time the New Testament was composed, within a few hundred years. If you took all the handwritten manuscripts we have and stacked them together, they'd be about 4 feet high. Do you know how tall it would go if we stacked all the manuscripts for the New Testament? Over 1 mile high. Friends, the New Testament is in a category of its own. There's more evidence for the New Testament than any 10 other ancient books put together. That's how compelling it is. Now, at the beginning, you remember my story that I said to these students. I said, wait a minute, if there's all these different manuscripts, there's between 300,000 and 400,000 variants, and that's true, or differences. So probably the most influential atheist today, his name is Bart Ehrman, went to Moody College, went to Wheaton Bible College, left his faith, now he's an atheist. He wrote a New York Times best-selling book called Misquoting Jesus, and he said there are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. Now, if you leave it at that, that's a little bit unsettling, isn't it? He'd say for every word in the New Testament, there could be 2 or 3 other words, and he's right about the number of variants, but he doesn't give you the whole story. You know what the rest of the story is? Yes, there's between 300,000 or 400,000 variants, but 75% of them are spelling differences that has nothing to do with meaning. So I got here 4 days ago. I was with my family in New Zealand, and they have British roots. So they spell words wrong, like honor, H-O-N-O-U-R. I told them, I'm like, you guys have serious spelling issues here, and they appreciated that a foreigner would tell them that. I said, you guys misspell color as well, C-O-L-O-U-R. Now, if you're reading something that says C-O-L, I'm just kidding. If you're reading, like, take a deep breath, it's okay. Oh, from Canada. So you too. All right, all right. All right. I do love America's hat. I'm just kidding. We're just having fun. We're bonding, you and me. What was I talking about? Oh, if you take all these differences and spelling differences, if you're reading something that says color with an O or a U, you know exactly what's meant by it. Other differences, for example, the Gospel of Mark is a very fast-moving, quick gospel. So sometimes chapter after chapter, instead of saying Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth, it says he. So some manuscript writers would put in the word Jesus instead of he. That's a variant and a difference, but it doesn't take away from the meaning, it adds to it. Now, interestingly enough, there's actually 2 passages in the New Testament, more than 2 verses, that we're not sure if they're in the original. Did you know this? So if you go, the only disputed New Testament passages more than 2 verses are Mark 16, 9 through 20, the last 12 verses of Mark, and John 7, 53 through 8, 11. You know what that story is? It's the story of the woman caught in adultery. You know what this means? It means the end of Mark, and that story of the woman caught in adultery is not in our earliest manuscripts. So scholars are undivided, they're divided about whether or not it was in the original. Now, Bart Ehrman writes, and he essentially says, we don't know the end of Mark, we don't know this part of John, we can't trust the New Testament. And I kind of say, well, if we don't know the end of Mark and we don't know that part of John, what follows is we're not sure about the end of Mark and we don't know that passage of John. That's it. Look, open up your Bibles. There's a footnote. Nobody's hiding this. We're just not sure about these 2 passages. We don't know. Scholars are working on it. This is why Craig Blomberg, one of the leading New Testament scholars today, says no orthodox doctrine or ethical practice of Christianity depends solely on any disputed wording. There are always undisputed passages one can consult that teach the same truths. Less than 1% of the New Testament has anything to do with meaning, and none of those has anything to do with an essential document. If we just look at how carefully the New Testament is preserved and passed down, it dwarfs any other ancient book. Our 3rd test is what we call the corroboration test. Now we're saying, can we corroborate this story from writings outside of the book? So this would be like archaeology or other ancient writings. Now, to give you an example, if you take the Book of Mormon, there are no convincing extra-biblical pieces of archaeology or writing that tell us the stories contained within the Book of Mormon are true. In fact, there's a lot of evidence against it. But that's not the case for the New Testament. For the New Testament, we haven't found everything. There's a lot of things we haven't discovered yet. But we consistently find archaeological accounts that support the biblical narrative. Just this week, I saw the city of Ziklag, described during the time of David, was just discovered. Just this week. That's unbelievable. So here's a couple examples. If you go to a place in Israel called Caesarea Maritima, you have this little inscription right here that's become very important. You know why? Because for years, the only evidence that Pontius Pilate existed was literary evidence, the New Testament and other writings. So some people surmised that Pontius Pilate was a fiction until they discovered this is actually a replica of it. I took a picture. The real one's in a museum, but it looks exactly like it. You know what it says? It refers to the time of Tiberius Caesar and the governor Pontius Pilate. In the time and place the New Testament describes. Friends, Pontius Pilate is not fictional. He was a real historical figure who had the exact position that the New Testament records when Jesus was condemned to death. Another example, if you turn to John chapter 5, there's this very interesting account of the city of Bethesda. And it describes in the city of Bethesda, there was a pool of Siloam that was there, and an angel would come down and touch the pool, and Jesus comes by it and does a miracle. Well, for years, people doubted that this place even existed, because in the account in Bethesda, it describes like 5 colonnades or 5 porticos that go right around this structure. Well, scholars dismissed this story because they said this is not how people would build. They didn't have 5 porticos. John must have written later from a legendary perspective and got his facts wrong. Now, this is actually a picture of me on a trip a few years ago. I took some students over, and we went to Bethesda. And you could look right over where I'm standing, right down, and guess what you could see? I'll tell you what we couldn't see. I had some students do a presentation on this one time, and a girl was describing the discovery, and she said, yes, the archaeologists dug in the city of Bethesda, and they found 5 porpoises. They didn't find dolphins, but they found 5 porticos, exactly as described in John. Now, one of my favorites, written by a scholar a number of years ago in the Harvard Theological Review, Dr. Hewitt said there's astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person were ever pierced by nails. You see, all the crucified victims we found had been crucified with rope. And yet, have you ever thought, how do we know Jesus was crucified with nails? Because what does Thomas want to see? Nail marks in his hand and in his feet. Yet every crucified victim we found had been crucified with ropes. Did the gospel writers get it wrong? That's what critical scholars assumed until in 1967 they found this in a tomb in Palestine in the middle of the 1st century. And no, this is not the heel bone of Jesus. I did this one time. As soon as they found Jesus, I'm like, they didn't find Jesus. I wouldn't be here giving this talk if they found Jesus. What did they find? It was a man who's been named Yehohanan, who was crucified with nails in his hands and his feet. And the nail was lodged in there, a 7-inch nail, which matches roughly the description in the gospel accounts. But you know what's most interesting about this? You remember when they came to the criminals, what did they do to speed up their death? They broke their legs. They came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. Well, we can't prove it. We have to be a little bit hesitant, but it very well may be that his legs, in fact, were broken. The way it's described happened to the criminals who are with Jesus. Friends, I've just given you 3 examples. I have a friend who teaches with me at Biola in our apologetics program. He has a PhD in archaeology and could talk for weeks about archaeological discoveries. In fact, recently I was reading an account, you'll know the story, that they discovered roughly 1,000 plus BC, that in the area of Judea, there were 2 central pillars, that if those 2 pillars broke, the entire edifice would fall down. Does that sound familiar from the story of Samson? Friends, over and over again, we discover an ancient seal, an ancient scroll, an ancient building, an ancient city that matches up with the biblical account. Now look, we haven't found everything. I can see that. But the way my father and I put it in evidence is this. Archaeology provides one important piece of evidence that helps confirm the New Testament record. So why should we trust the New Testament? Remember, the writers say, we saw, we heard, we touched, we carefully investigated everything. Peter says, I was an eyewitness. And then, rather than a story in a distant galaxy, Luke says, these people, this time, this place, all specific facts we can back up. And then the New Testament writers give embarrassing material showing they care about truth, and then they're willing to suffer and die for their belief Jesus rose again. They sure seem to have the character to care about truth. But then we have more manuscripts and earlier manuscripts than any other ancient book, and we find support from archaeology. Friends, it tells me the New Testament is unique. We can trust that the biblical writers got it right. So I mentioned years ago my father set out to disprove Christianity. He had a rough background, but I didn't tell you how much. You see, my dad was sexually abused for 7 years by someone who lived on their farm between 6 years old, about 6 or 7 years old, and 13, till he was strong enough to slam the man against the wall on the farm he lived at in Michigan and say, if you touch me again, I'll kill you. My dad's older sister, my aunt, committed suicide. My dad's older brother, my uncle, sued his father, my grandfather, for everything he had, and my dad's dad was the town drunk. Not long ago, we were sitting together as a family, and my sister Heather goes, hey, Dad, share a funny story, a good memory you have when you're a kid. And my dad says, kids, I don't have one. I mean, let that sink in. I sat there and I wept. I thought, my dad didn't have one good memory when he was a kid. My dad set out to disprove the Bible years ago, and he was stunned at how much evidence there was, but that's not what convinced him. You know what convinced him? It's when he understood the love of God. See, what changed my dad's life was not that he realized there's manuscripts and there's archaeology and there's embarrassing details and this story is true. What changed my dad's life is when he opened up his heart and began to read the scriptures. And the commandment that says, forgive one another. When my dad became a Christian, he was being discipled by a man. He said to my dad, he said, you need to be willing to forgive the man who sexually abused you. And my dad said, not going to happen. I will usher him myself to hell. But you know what? God kept working on his heart. And he kept softening my dad. And eventually he realized if he was going to be free from this pain, he had to be willing to forgive this man. So my dad went to see him. His name was Wayne Bailey. Went to see him. He had moved away years ago. And he knocked on the door. He showed him. He said, Wayne, what you did to me is evil. But I become a Christian. And I've experienced God's forgiveness and transformation in my life. And I hope you know that God died as much for you through Jesus as he did for me. And he walked away. And then he turned around and said, if I hear any stories about you doing this to another kid, I will come after you. I like that. And I'll make sure you get punished for this. Not himself. He's not a vengeance like Liam Neeson. But you get the point. In the movies. You know, my dad became a believer. And one of the most powerful things is he went to see my grandfather who's a drunk. And he told my grandfather, because God had changed his life, he said, Dad, I love you. And it stunned my grandpa. Shortly after that, my father was in a car accident where his life, he was this close to being cast in front of a train and dying, and I would not be here if that had happened for obvious reasons. My dad came home and his mother had already passed away by this time. And he was laying in bed, full body cast. And my grandfather came up to him, paced forever, and he said, son, how can you love me? How can you love a father such as me? And my dad looked at him, he said, my dad was in his 20s. He said, Dad, 6 months ago, I hated your guts. But Jesus has risen from the grave. The Bible's true. And God has transformed my life from within. I love you. And my grandfather, the town drunk, looked at him. He said, son, if God can do in my life what he's done in yours, I want to give him a chance. And right there, my dad led my grandfather to Christ, and he never had another sip of alcohol. Friends, we haven't looked at all the details. There's so much more we could unpack to see that this book is true. But you know what? Faith is not blind. Faith is trusting God because of what we have reason to believe is true. The same God who split the Red Sea and rose Jesus from the grave is alive and well and active and changing lives if you will let him, through the Holy Spirit and the Scripture, begin to change you. That is my hope and prayer for you. Yes, be ready with an answer. That's why we're here, to have a reason and an answer. But we better first let that truth of Scripture go inside of us and transform us so we can defend it and live it in love with our neighbors. Hey, I want to take you on a journey with me this morning. But I got to ask you something. Has anybody here had a difficult conversation with somebody you dreaded and you just kind of hoped it would go away? Have you had that kind of conversation? Yeah, I remember the day I got my license because the day afterwards I was driving to town in my dad's 51 totally minted out truck and I hit a deer. I almost cried. It was like Bambi's dying on the side of the road, wrecked my dad's car. So I had to call him and tell him about it. But I actually remember another conversation with my dad that was really difficult. And to understand why it's so tough, you've got to understand something about my father's story. Some of you might recognize the name Josh McDowell. My dad has been around for a long time speaking, teaching, and writing. In fact, my dad has written over 150 books, spoken to more young people alive than anybody in history. Crazy stuff, proclaiming truth around the world. But my dad's story was, he grew up in a messed up, difficult background. You see, my dad's dad was the town drunk. In a small town, everybody knew who it was. My dad's older sister committed suicide. My dad grew up with a lot of hate and a lot of anger. To make a long story short, he met some Christians who challenged him to consider the claims of Christ. My dad thought it was a joke, so he started traveling around the world, gathering the evidence to prove that Christianity's false. To make a long story short, he ended up becoming a Christian, realizing the Bible's true, Jesus is God, and he rose from the grave. And then he spent his life teaching and proclaiming this around the world. When I was not too much older than most of you here, probably 19 years old, I started to have some serious doubts about what I believed. I started to read The Other Side by atheists and by skeptics, and I read Muslim material and other non-Christians. I thought, what if I grew up in a different home? Gosh, what if I'm wrong? And I realized I need to tell my dad. Now, can you understand why I was nervous to tell my dad? He spent his life proclaiming, teaching, debating Christianity. His son is like, yeah, not sure if I buy it. So we were in the mountains in Breckenridge, asked my dad to go out for coffee. We sat down, I remember looking in the eyes and said, Dad, I want you to know something. I want to know truth, but I'm not sure I believe Christianity is true. Not knowing what he was going to say. He didn't miss a beat. He looks right back and he goes, son, I think that's great. And my first thought was, did you hear anything that I just said? He said, yes, I heard you. He goes, I sense you want to know truth. If you really seek after truth, I'm confident you'll be led back to Jesus because Jesus is the truth. And then he said, look, you know your mom and I will love you no matter what. He said, look, don't be like some people who grow up in the church and they reject their faith just out of spite. He said, if you walk away, only do so because you've studied it, you've thought about it, and you're convinced that it's not true. And that was good advice. And here I am years later, obviously convinced that it's true. But can you tell how differently my dad and our story is? My dad's from a broken home, looks inside Christianity, is trying to prove it false to write a book about it. I'm growing up within the Christian home saying, all right, my parents taught me this. I know they mean me well. I went to some great conferences, but I don't know if I really believe this. Although our stories were different, you know what we have in common? Is that both of us began our serious spiritual quest by considering the claims of Christianity. What I want to persuade you of this morning is that a thoughtful person on a spiritual quest would begin by considering the claims of Christianity. Meaning there are 4 things in particular that make Christianity unique and different. We're going to look at 4 unique things about Christianity. Now, I teach at Biola University, but I still teach high school. I have 2 classes this fall. I have a freshman, sophomore class. I have a junior, senior class, because my heartbeat is really the next generation. Hence, I keep getting the opportunity to come back to Momentum for a few years. That's really my heartbeat and my passion. But I take my students, I got tired of seeing my students graduate, go to the university, and have their faith picked apart by some professor who had a very different belief system. Do you know there's 2 to 3 times as many atheists and agnostics in the university than there is in the public as a whole? I got tired of seeing my students do that. So I got together with a friend of mine. I said, we need to take our students to the most godless secular place we can find. Bring in atheists, agnostics, let them speak to our students, but we will train our students so well that they can defend their faith and they'll walk away with more confidence. So this past year, I took 25 high school students to Berkeley. Now, if you don't know where Berkeley is in San Francisco, it's like the most secular, liberal place, certainly in America. And we bring in a bunch of atheists to speak to our students. Now, we got this invitation while we were there that there's this atheist group on campus, and their name is SANE, S-A-N-E. You know what it stands for? Students for a Non-Religious Ethos. They have clubs and meetings to try to get rid of religion and silence people like you and people like me. They invited my friend and I to come speak to our group. It was awesome. So I showed up thinking these are undergrads, and there were PhD students, there were master's students in physics and philosophy. And the question is, what would you say if you had a chance to present to a group like this? You know what I did? Instead of arguing that Christianity is true, instead of arguing that God exists or the Bible is true, all I said to him is, I said, look, I want to appeal to you. If you are open-minded, I want to give you 4 reasons why a thoughtful person would begin their quest by examining Christianity. That's it. All we said was, if you're a thoughtful person, what do you think everybody at Berkeley wants to consider themselves? A thoughtful person. You would just begin your spiritual quest by considering Christianity. Gave them 4 reasons. And you know what's interesting about this? This is not just my opinion, Mr. Christian speaker, teacher, professor. Do you know for the past 50 years, the most widely read philosophical atheist in the world, going back to when he presented a paper before C.S. Lewis in England, his name was Antony Flew. He died in 2010. Do you know in 2007 he released a book? You know what it was titled? There Is a God. Is that incredible? You know what he said? He said, I found all this evidence for God and I couldn't hide it anymore. But look at what Antony Flew says. He says, I think the Christian religion, even though he didn't become a Christian, is the one religion that most clearly deserves to be honored and respected. There's nothing like the combination of a charismatic figure like Jesus and a first-class intellectual like St. Paul. If you're wanting omnipotence to set up a religion, this is the one to beat. And I think he's right. And he didn't mean like beat it like this, as we're seeing in culture today. He means this is the one that stands above all the others. Now you might be sitting there going, I'm a Christian, I'm not on a spiritual quest. Well look, if you're a Christian, I hope you're in conversation with non-Christians. I want to equip you this morning to be more confident in sharing and discussing your faith with others. I understand a few hundred of you became believers during Clayton's message. Praise the Lord. If there's any of you that are still like, I don't know if I buy it, I'm not sure if I'm there yet, then all I ask this morning is you be open-minded and consider, could Christianity really be unique among the different religions? So let's get started. The first reason, 4 reasons that set Christianity apart for somebody on a spiritual quest. The number one reminds me of a movie called The Body. And you'll see a poster coming up here. It's a movie with Antonio Banderas. And it was, why are you laughing? I know, I said it with a mild Southern California Spanish accent. That's as far as it goes. Antonio Banderas, in this movie, it was a few years ago, here's the story. He's a former Green Beret, and he becomes a Catholic priest. And what happens in the movie, the reason it's called The Body, is because they discover this tomb, a rich man's tomb, in Jerusalem, dating the 1st century. They find a coin from Pilate, and they find a body who'd been crucified. So guess who they thought it was? Okay, 3 of you gave the answer. If you don't know the answer to a question at any Christian function, just say Jesus, and you'll get it right. I tell my students, I'm like, if you're taking a test and there's a fill-in and you don't know the answer, just write Jesus, right? I mean, look, I have 3 kids. My son, 11, daughter's 8, and then I have a son who'll be 3 next month. And my daughter, who's 8, She's going into third grade, but I remember when she was going in kindergarten, this is when the teachers teach the students to raise their hand and not blurt out answers in class. So the first day of class, the teacher said, students, raise your hand, I'll call on you. What's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? Nothing. She thought, this is strange. 5-year-olds know this. What's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? No student raised their hand. She said, class, raise your hand. I'll call on you if you know the answer. She said, class, what's gray, has a big bushy tail, and climbs in trees? Finally, my daughter Sean, his classmate, little Johnny, raised his hand. She said, yes, Johnny. He said, I'll say Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. Now, in this movie, The Body, do you realize what they find? They find an empty tomb. It's a rich man's tomb, a body that had been crucified from the 1st century, a coin from Pilate, so they think it's the body of Jesus. Now, what happens? In the movie, the whole Catholic Church goes into an uproar. It becomes a huge conspiracy. Now, think about it. Would it matter for any movie to find the body of Muhammad? Would that change anything? No. Would it matter if we found the body of Buddha? Would that change anything? No. Joseph Smith, Krishna, any other major spiritual religious figure throughout history, it wouldn't matter if we found their body. But if we find the body of Jesus, everything changes. Everything changes if we find the body of Jesus. You know why? Look at this passage. This is one of the most bizarre passages in religion. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes to the Corinthian church. He says, if Christ is not risen, our faith is worthless. Do you realize that if my backpack in the back, if I had the skull of Jesus back there,